Welcome everybody here tonight. My name is Bishop Miller. I'm the Bishop of the local congregation here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. We will, as custom, begin by having an opening prayer that will be offered by Steve Sinte, and then we'll have Mr. Wheeler from the Historical Society introduce Dr. Hecker, and we'll go from there.
Our Father which art in heaven, we're thankful this evening to gather together as friends and community to celebrate our friendship and our caring for one another, and also to join together in discussing world events and enjoying each other's company. We're thankful for those who have traveled, thankful for the safety in our travel, for the blessings that we enjoy in our community in this winter time. We ask that thy blessing of thy spirit of peace and joy will be upon us. Pray that as we socialize this evening that we might feel an increase of the spirit in our community, of unity with one another and also with the larger world as we discuss. We ask that thy spirit will be upon those who are traveling, that they might arrive in safety, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Mike Wheeler. I'm the president of the board of the Los Alamos Historical Society. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Sig Hecker. Although in this town he hardly needs to be introduced, as many of you know him from your years of working at the laboratory, perhaps during the period of 1986 through 1997 when he was our director, or from his years as a staff member. Sig Hecker is an expert in nuclear weapons, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear strategy. He has received the Enrico Fermi Award, the Seaborg Medal, the DOE's Distinguished Associate Award, and the E.O. Lawrence Award. He was uniquely qualified during the end of the Cold War to work extensively with his Soviet counterparts on joint verification experiments to confirm each country's compliance with treaty limits on nuclear testing. Dr. Hecker is currently affiliated with Stanford University, where he is research professor emeritus. His research focuses on non-proliferation and the challenges posed by nuclear countries in various parts of the world. His expertise is highly valued, and we are truly lucky that he is willing to share his valuable time each year to offer us his insights about today's nuclear issues. Before I turn over the microphone to Dr. Hecker, let me also say that the Historical Society is honored that he chose Bathtub Row Press, the publishing arm of the Historical Society, to publish his 2-volume work called Doomed to Cooperate, or How America and Russian Scientists Joined Forces to Avert Some of the Greatest Post-Cold War Nuclear Dangers. In addition, he donated the proceeds from this work to the Los Alamos Historical Society. Please join me in giving our friend Sig Hecker a warm welcome.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be back in Los Alamos. And first and foremost, let me say that I also want to extend my love and appreciation to the Manns, to Laurie Mann and to Alice, who've done over the years so much for this community. And as you know, Laurie is no longer with us. Alice is with us, but unfortunately for us, she's right now with one of the daughters in San Diego, and she was not able to make it back. But those are the kind of people that make Los Alamos the community that it's been. And then the other opening remark is, I've said it before, but only in Los Alamos on a Saturday night can you get this many people out to listen to a topic like nuclear hotspots. But you're here and I'm ready to go. So let's do that. So a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I gave an update, and particularly I laid out that 2017 was a very dangerous year on the Korean Peninsula. And quite frankly, I thought we stood on the precipice of war. The war of words from President Trump and Kim Jong-un. So what I'm going to do first is sort of go through what's happened in 2018 and then move into 2019. I'm not going to try to predict what happens because, of course, as you know, it's especially difficult to predict anything about the future. So the main message, 2018 is there were no real nuclear alerts. As bad as it looked coming out of 2017, from a nuclear standpoint, it wasn't all that bad. In fact, if one looked at the nuclear option, about the only discussion of the nuclear options in 2018 and also a few years before then was the nuclear option in the Senate, in the domestic arena. The nuclear option is one where the rules are changed so it doesn't take 60 votes in the Senate to override a filibuster. And actually, Harry Reid, when he was in charge of the Senate, used that nuclear option once in order to try to get Obama appointments confirmed. And so, of course, there was a lot of discussion about nuclear options related to Supreme Court justice and so forth, but the rest of the world, not that much discussion in nuclear options. And in fact, if we look at North Korea, we really stepped away from the precipice of war. Right there you see it, in the Singapore summit, essentially almost exactly 6 months ago today. If we look at Iran, there's really an expectation that perhaps Iran would go back and really rev up its nuclear program as President Trump stepped away from the Iran deal during the year. And in fact, he stepped away from the deal because he thought it was indeed the worst deal ever made. And he did have quite a bit of help from Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. And I'll discuss that in more detail. But nevertheless, we didn't have a nuclear altercation in 2018. In Russia, of course, there's been lots of news, lots of bluster, but not much change. Most of the issue was something you've heard President Trump say many times, no collusion. The Russians. But if you look a little deeper, and if you can see the faces from Michael Flynn to Paul Manafort to Putin looming in the background, or Robert Mueller out there somewhere, he's pretty quiet. But obviously something is happening with respect to Russia. But we didn't have a big nuclear deal. China, there was no nuclear buildup. There was certainly a lot of activity in China, especially on the economic front. But it turns out President Xi Jinping did manage to get term limits abolished, and so he more or less is president for life in China. Then we had India, Pakistan. I've talked about them in the past. And again, the good news is there was no nuclear confrontation. There was also no further on, as best as we know, nuclear proliferation in the world. And then, very importantly, there was no nuclear terror attack, neither a mushroom cloud nor a dirty bomb in 2018. So I would say if you put all of that together, that's not that bad a record for 2018. However, sort of lurking in the background, there's certainly undercurrents of concern. And, if this gets a little too small to read, I'll make sure to at least give you the gist of this. But the U.S. has pulled out of nuclear deals. The Iran deal, so-called JCPOA, the INF treaty, President Trump has said he will step away from INF. That's the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev signed in 1987. And then there are concerns about the New START Treaty, and that's the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that President Obama signed, some 8 years ago with, at that time, President Medvedev. And so as you look, it does seem like U.S. and Russia is poised for a new arms race. With China, we're keeping an eye on China, really not quite sure what's going to happen. India, Pakistan, they're still not talking. That enmity is there since the beginning of those countries. That was 1947. Iran, it's flexing its muscle in the Middle East, and of course, there's the question, is it sitting on a nuclear return? North Korea, and that's what I'll spend quite a bit of time on because I spend a lot of my time thinking and working on North Korea. The doors opened with that Singapore summit, but we've not seen any tactical steps that go towards what we call denuclearization. And then the thing that bothers me quite a bit, and I'll mention that some, is the nuclear share of the world's electricity is actually declining. And then, fortunately for nuclear terrorism, we've not seen it, but that's always a continuing concern. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm going to walk through this, and first I will walk through an update on Russia. And Mike has already mentioned just a couple of years ago, with the help of Sharon Snyder and all the other good folks at Historical Society and Bathtub Row Press, we managed to publish this tome of 2 volumes, 1,000 pages, of the remarkable cooperation of many of you in this room with the Russians during those difficult times when the Soviet Union broke up. And we probably faced the greatest nuclear danger that we have faced to date. And so this book tells such a fantastic story, and it's not just from the American side, but also from the Russian side, because I managed to get the Russians to tell their story. So half of those articles in that book are the Russians talking about what it was like to work with the Americans and what was accomplished. So this was so important that I thought it was important to get this book translated into Russian. It turns out that was the initial intent. But after Russia took Crimea and went and played around in eastern Ukraine, then my colleagues on the Russian side were not allowed to finish their co-editorship. However, we had the articles, we published them, they said that's great, and lo and behold, last year, they actually did start the translation. And so Sharon, the first volume is actually done, and quite frankly, they did a beautiful job, absolutely beautiful job. It must be 100 pages longer than the English translation because the Russians just take longer to say the same thing. Sometimes very poetically, but they take a lot of space. And so here it is, the first volume was done. I managed to get a copy, but then that's the good news. The bad news is the curtain came down, and particularly the person, the academician Avrorin, who many of you in this room know, who was working with me on this, and he was very well respected in the Russian enterprise. He died. And unfortunately, at that point, the Moscow folks took over, and they said to the people at their laboratory, we call it their Livermore, at Vinitiev in Snezhinsk, they said, you're not going to do the second volume. And so we have a first volume and not a second volume. And for the most part, that's associated with a lot of the things that we've seen come out of Russia and sort of, Putin's bravado about what they've been able to accomplish in the nuclear business in the last few years. At the upper left and upper right is this crazy idea of a nuclear torpedo that would essentially, like a drone, an underwater drone that would take 6 days to get over here from Russia and then blow up a big mushroom cloud and spread all kinds of other radioactivity all over New York Harbor. And they did that mostly to be able to demonstrate to the Americans, while you put all your efforts into anti-ballistic missiles, you stepped away from the treaty. Guess what? You're not going to get that thing under sea. You know, it's a stealth drone and it's going to come across and get you. The one on the bottom is a test that they just did before New Year's, and that's Putin's quote. This is a wonderful, excellent New Year's present for our country, and it's a hypersonic glide vehicle that can deliver potentially a nuclear weapon. That also would be aimed at, unlike missiles, you know, which have the standard trajectory, and you can try to at least shoot them down unless there are too many of them. This thing flies just under space in the top of the atmosphere at incredible speeds, and essentially there's no defense against it. We, the United States, we have hypersonic glide vehicles, but actually we're not crazy enough to try to put a nuclear warhead on one of those. You know, that is really going way out. And he does that to demonstrate that, look, you know, you guys, you Americans, you stepped on us Russians when we were weak in the 1990s, and we're back. And we're back big time. Am I concerned about these weapons? Actually, quite frankly, no. What in the world are they going to do with these? But nevertheless, that's the position where we're at. And along with that, the way it ties to the book story is that Putin has now changed the narrative that what happened in the 1990s was the United States taking advantage of a weak Russia. And now we're back. And that book tells exactly the opposite story. We worked together to overcome a common threat. And so he doesn't want the book. However, I think we've found another way to do this. But in the meantime, it turns out we also haven't had any help from our own president. You know, as he wants to step away from this Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which quite frankly is very much in this country's favor. In 1987, Reagan was willing to give up. These are ground-launched nuclear weapons that are in a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. In other words, they're in the European, mostly European theater. And the reason Reagan gave them up is we don't need them. We've got all kinds of other ways to cover those targets. Yet the Russians finally figured out that, hey, this was not such a good deal. So they've been working on the edges of this treaty and most likely violating it. And then Trump, instead of trying to negotiate a way out of that, has said he's going to step away. And Putin has said, all right, look, we'll build missiles and we'll just keep on building missiles. There'll be nothing left but an arms race. And then it turns out, you know, President Trump has this advisor, his national security advisor, John Bolton, who hates treaties. He hates the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty is sort of the current bedrock, you know, that limits the number of missiles, that is the standard long-range missiles, to 1,550 for each country, which, for heaven's sakes, is plenty for each country. But Bolton never liked that, and so now there's concern what's going to happen to the New START Treaty. So that's the concern as we move into 2019 and beyond. You know, are we really back to a nuclear arms race? And what can we do about it? Well, obviously, that's way above my pay grade. And now they've cut off the cooperation between the nuclear laboratories. So Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia is no longer working with their version of Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, and Sandia. So instead, what I've decided to do is to go to the next generation. And that is, I think our best hope are the young folks. And so I found a university in Russia. It's called MIFI, Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute. It's their main training ground for their nuclear younger generation. And so we've held a number of what we call young professional nuclear forums. And so we get 10 or so Americans together with 10 or so Russians, and we take them through various exercises and have them go try to solve some of the world's problems. And the results are just absolutely spectacular. And so there may not be much hope for Putin, there may not be much hope for Trump, there may not be much hope for the rest of us, in this room, but I think there's hope in this younger generation. So I take, this was at Stanford in May. In late October, took 9 American young professionals, anywhere from grad students, postdocs, young professionals in early part of their career, to Russia. We met with 15 of their young professionals. We met at MIFI, which is this Moscow Engineering Physics Institute. At Stanford, I had them work an exercise on North Korea 2 weeks before the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore. And I had them be advisors to Kim and or to Trump. And they worked through and tried to come up with solutions as to what should one be doing at the summit. In Moscow, we had them work on the Iran crisis related to the Americans stepping away. We also had them, as shown here, we have these breakout sessions. And here the young Americans and Russian mixed together. And here we were working, in addition to the Iran problem, the future of global nuclear power. Having Russians come from a very different perspective about the need for nuclear power. They're absolutely convinced that nuclear power is still the future. To the Americans, where nuclear power has been decreasing significantly. And then trying to work out as to where we go from here. In addition, thanks to a very good friend, the young lady sitting on the right at the bottom, she's actually a 33-year-old Duma member, that is, member of their Congress, the lower house of Congress. Her name is Inga Yumasheva. And she arranged for the young professionals to have a session with 3 Duma members, chairs of their important committees. So can you imagine, so here 9 young Americans meeting with Russian Duma members, and it was a fascinating interchange. The Russians were pulsing the Americans about why are we stepping away from this INF treaty. And the questions were just superb. So we also then took them to take in a little bit of the Russian culture. Because that's the one thing, no matter what you think about Russia, their culture, their history is so rich, it's incredible. So we went to a pelmeni joint. Nothing fancy, somewhere tucked away in Moscow. Pelmeni are these Siberian dumplings. And this was a pelmeni shop. And the sign that you see essentially says, make them and boil them, because that's what you do with pelmenis. Actually, folklore has it that in Siberia, particularly in the older days before any of the warming, the Russian women would make, 1,000 pelmenis and hang them out on the clothesline in November, and then you just pick them off for dinner because they stayed frozen the whole time. So you make them and you boil them. And then to show you the sort of sense of humor that one still finds. I mean, these guys did not know we were coming. Okay, we come to this place, and there's a guy, the main person there, I guess he's the owner of the pelmeni shop. Doesn't speak any English. A couple of our Americans actually spoke English, and all the Russians spoke English, most of them quite well. But I was just really amused by his T-shirt. Okay, again, this is a Russian place in Moscow. Make pelmeni great again. How can you not like the Russians? I mean, if they got a sense of humor like that, just incredible. All right, so that's what we do with the Russians. So the idea is, look, if we can't get those folks up in the government to get off in the right direction, one of these days, our countries are going to come back together. Because quite frankly, it makes absolutely no sense for the United States and Russia to be enemies. It just simply makes no sense. All the strategic, all the other reasons just aren't there. There's just this funny aspect of history. I was watching a night before last a talk given at Yale by this Vladimir Potsna. He's a journalist, and he gave this very interesting talk, essentially saying that we, the Americans, made Putin. It's our fault. In terms of how we dealt with the Russians in the 1990s. I don't particularly believe that it was our fault. I mean, the Russians are grown up, they do their own thing. But we didn't have to go there, and we don't have to go there in the future. China is going to be a different problem. China is going to be a major competitor no matter how we lay it out. But in Russia, it doesn't make any sense. So my view is, if we ever get back together to work together, there's got to be somebody who's excited that wants to do that. When we started doing this, 1988, Mike mentioned the joint verification experiment. That's when it started. We had people at Los Alamos, my colleagues, who were really excited to go to Russia, to go work with the Russians. This was an adventure. It was exciting. Who's going to be excited today? I mean, we've demonized the Russians so badly. Who wants to go to Russia? It turns out in Russia, they're now demonizing the Americans. But these young folks don't demonize each other. They came to San Francisco, went across the Golden Gate Bridge. We went to Red Square with them. It's a different world. And we made Tomeni great again. They were good. So China, do something very similar to China. Again, China today is a much more difficult problem because China actually is so smart. From a standpoint, they figured out that the way that they're going to move up in the world is economically. They're going to be able to buy the world. And so they've put things together economically, and they've been smart enough not to put all their money into nuclear things. So unlike Putin, they're not doing all of these nuclear gadgets and new nuclear things. I mean, their conventional forces have been significantly, strengthened. But they're not putting their money into nuclear. So I work with the Chinese in the same way, again, with the young professionals in China, because China is a big player now in the civilian nuclear arena. They're building half of the nuclear reactors in the world are being built in China. And then China would like to build many others in the rest of the world. If they're going to build those reactors, they have to now step in and play the kind of role the United States has played for all of these years. How to make sure the nuclear reactors are safe, how to make sure they're secure, how to make sure that if we do export them, that we don't have nuclear proliferation all over. The Chinese never paid much attention to that before. And so that's what we're working with the Chinese and with their young folks. And it's very, very similar. Again, you get the young people together. You get them to talk to each other. You get them to work common problems together. Then all of these other things sort of go away. So very, very similar situation. We've also, the second thing I've done a lot with Chinese, and this is with not just the young professionals, but my counterparts, is we've analyzed North Korea together. I think I've said to this audience before, when I first went to North Korea in 2004, and I came back, I went through China to come back home, and the Chinese didn't believe. They said those North Koreans can't tie their own shoes. Well, they don't believe that anymore. And so we're pretty much in sync, that we both have a pretty good understanding that, first of all, these guys are really competent, and they know how to build a bomb. And of course, by now, they've tested 6 of them, and so we know they can build a bomb. So we work together with the Chinese in trying to address how do we get the best assessment of what North Korea actually has. Okay, just a quick move on to Iran, and that is President Trump very proudly pulled out of the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, this so-called JPOA. He called it an embarrassment. And he had help from Netanyahu. And actually what Netanyahu dug up, for the most part, many of us in this room knew that. We never thought that Iran was just there doing nuclear energy. I mean, my interpretation is always, and I've met with the Iranians, and they told me they're just doing nuclear energy. I said, look, I know you guys are building the option for the bomb. You may not want to build the bomb, but you're putting all of the pieces in place. And that's what Netanyahu and the Mossad was able to demonstrate pretty clearly. I mean, these guys were putting all of the pieces in place that should they want to turn the switch to build a bomb, they could do so pretty quickly. But what was Obama's crowning foreign policy achievement is what Trump calls an embarrassment. And that is that JCPOA, the Iran deal, did indeed, from the nuclear standpoint, it moved Iran farther away from being able to build a bomb. There's no question about that. Would it mean that it's irreversible? Of course not. Nothing is irreversible. If you remember Manhattan Project, 27 months, from nothing to the bomb. And so, of course, they can do it. But Trump, Netanyahu, and many others in this country simply are concerned about all the other things that Iran does in the neighborhood. And so they didn't like any of that. So Trump pulled out, and the question was, how is Iran going to respond? And then how are our allies, or let's say the other countries we've worked with, going to respond? And I've taken this out of off the internet. A lot of people have said this means war, if Trump pulls out. And Netanyahu more or less has given the go-ahead. But if you look at the upper right, that's the Chinese with the foreign minister of Iran. They think the deal was a great deal. China needs Iran's oil. On the lower right, that's Putin and Rouhani. They seem to be in pretty good spirits. The ones that are not in such good spirits are the ones on the lower left. And that's Macron from France, Angela Merkel from Germany, and Theresa May from the UK. They don't know what to do with themselves. I mean, here, Trump just pulled out of this thing that they had to put together. And so they're sticking with the deal. And right now, quite frankly, we don't know how it's going to go. My personal feeling is it's not going to go nuclear because Iran is smart enough that if they take a step back into the nuclear world, it will actually cost them a lot. They certainly fear Israel, and they fear what the United States might do. So they're doing pretty well. And as long as the sanctions being put back by the Americans aren't going to kill them, I don't think they're going to go back to the nuclear world. But Iran's got a lot of things going on in Iraq, in Syria, with Hezbollah, with the Hamas, in Yemen. So I'm not sure. That Middle East stays a pretty dangerous place. India and Pakistan, very unfortunate. I mean, they're continuing to build up the nuclear weapons. Of course, we're not talking about the thousands that US and Russia have, but they're in the 100 or so now. And then particularly troublesome is they both decided they need the triad, because we the big guys, you say we need the triad. Triad means land, missiles. It means air, bombers, and it means submarines, or naval. And so they're working in that direction. They each only have 6 tests. I personally don't see how in the world they can be thinking about a triad with that many nuclear tests under their belt. But new things have happened in India and Pakistan. Pakistan has a populist, actually a cricket player, as the new prime minister, and that's Imran Khan. India has a very nationalistic Mr. Modi. And at least, since Imran Khan was elected about 6 months ago, things seem to be reasonably decent shape. But there's still not much talk. The Indians, for the most part, would just wish the Pakistanis would go away. And the Pakistanis just want Kashmir back from the Indians, that happened in 1947. So I'm not sure how it's going to go. I've worked very closely with Pakistan. We had a session at Stanford just this past August to try to sort out with the Pakistanis as to what can be done. But quite frankly, right now, I would say the best way to put it in Washington, as far as India and Pakistan is concerned, there's nobody home. It's just not getting attention. We're paying attention to building a wall, and we ought to be worried about what happens down in South Asia. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. The other thing I do want to point out is at Stanford, we have the benefit. I don't think of myself as old, but other people remind me. However, when I really feel young is when I get together with these two gentlemen who helped me with Pakistan. And you can't see it from where you're sitting, but this gentleman is none other than Bill Perry, who was our 19th Secretary of Defense and one of the finest people, individuals you'll ever have the pleasure of knowing. He turned 91 just after this meeting. But the guy next to him says, you know, this guy Perry, he's a real promising young man. That guy is George Shultz. He was Secretary of everything. George just turned 98 in December. And to be in the presence of those two guys, their mental acuity and their knowledge of the history of the world is just incredible. And what a difference from where we are today. I mean, it is just absolutely astounding. And the Pakistanis have enormous respect for them. Okay, so let me turn away from those nuclear places and go closer to home. Nina and I were there when the campfire roared, less than 100 miles from where we are in Mountain View in California. And even though, of course, we've had this devastation here at Los Alamos twice, 2000 and 2011, this one was worse than anything I've ever seen. It was so fast. It was so devastating. And, of course, one can't blame any specific thing on global warming. But it's that entire issue of the global climate change that's just created the conditions that when you have something like this happen today, it can run away. And it did run away. And that's where my comment about nuclear power comes in, that unfortunately, the nuclear electricity, here's the nuclear electricity generation total. It's plateaued over the years. This is 2005, 2013, 14. It's plateaued and then gone down some. It's gone down some more since. And then the percentage of electricity generated by nuclear has decreased. And if there's any time, in the history of our globe that we need clean power, it's now. And nuclear power, and of course as much solar as we can get, as much wind as we can get, that much the better. But I personally believe we need nuclear. Actually, almost all of my students also believe that you need to have nuclear power. You've got to manage the other issues, the safety, the security, the proliferation, but those are manageable. The Earth warming up at the pace that it is, that's not manageable. And so the reason we gave this generation, this young professional generation, this assignment of looking at global nuclear warming is that one can say for that generation, it's the first generation that feels the really drastic effects of global warming. And they may be the last generation that can do something about it. That's why we gave them that assignment. Okay, then nuclear terrorism, quite frankly, I don't know why it hasn't happened to date. We're extremely fortunate, and the most important thing to do is to be ready. We're not doing enough. This is an area where the whole world needs to work together. In other words, after the first attack, how do we avoid the second? The first one's going to happen at some time, someplace. Because here it's not, it's not plutonium, it's not highly enriched uranium. Those would be poor fuel for a dirty bomb, for example, particularly a dirty bomb. The mushroom cloud, there's some understanding why that's not there. It's hard to get the plutonium, hard to get the highly enriched uranium. It's difficult to build a bomb. A dirty bomb is not difficult. You take medical isotopes, you spread them around. So that needs attention. Okay, so let me get to this. That's worth a look, isn't it? I showed you that last year because that's what happened in 2017. I also, in that talk, I came along and I said, let's make an analogy. I mean, if you've got two guys that are on hair trigger that are about to blow up, let's make an analogy to nuclear reactors. What do you do in a nuclear reactor if, the reaction is about to run away and cause a meltdown? You use control rods. You lower the control rods and they suck up the neutrons and stop the reaction. And I said, thank God we've got control rods, Tillerson and Mattis. Well, you know, the rest of the story, they're now both gone. They're both gone. However, I just told you, nothing terrible happened in North Korea. Something that I would have never predicted. You know who the control rod was? It was Trump. See, I don't get a big laugh because it's true. Trump lowered the temperature. He avoided the meltdown. He's been criticized left and right for giving this young man, who's a brutal dictator without question, for giving him the world stage. But that's what it took to lower the temperature. That's what it took to potentially change the whole relationship and the environment where you might be able to actually resolve this problem. Now, this was a one-day deal, June 12th of 2018. He's had 6 months since. We haven't had much progress because the rest of that story is much more difficult than shaking hands or slapping on the back. But, and it wasn't just Trump, but I really do want to emphasize the fact that Trump met with Kim Jong-un really had this major, major change. It couldn't have been accomplished with other people meeting with him. He did it. He had lots of help, particularly, as I will point out, President Moon of South Korea has really stepped up. And these are collage of pictures from the Olympics. I'm sure most of you watched that. It was dramatic. To watch those two countries, North and South, march in under one unified flag was just incredible. And then Moon and Kim met at the first summit in Panmunjom at the demilitarized zone. And I like photos. If you look at those photos, look at their faces. Something's going on, something's happening between North and South. And it was crucial. And then indeed there was the summit, the one-day affair, one-night stand was there. They signed the Singapore Joint Statement. It's been criticized for not having much, but quite frankly, for a first summit, that's sort of the best that you can do. And it has the essential elements. However, almost the entire American news media has not paid close attention to what that summit statement actually said. 3 out of the 4 bullets are associated with what I call normalization. In other words, read those words: commit to establish a new DPRK, North Korea relations, in accordance with the desire of the peoples of the two countries for peace and prosperity. So in other words, Trump signed this thing which said, we're going to develop a new relationship with you guys. And then we're going to join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And then the fourth one is we're going to give back, the missing in action and POW remains. They did that, by the way. And then the third one was this denuclearization. And the US, the news media, and all the pundits have been focused strictly on that. Are the North Koreans do what they said they're going to do and denuclearize? Well, I have to point out, have we done what we said we were going to do to normalize? The answer is no. Trump has said, yeah, we want them to denuclearize. Kim Jong-un is a good buddy of mine. We love each other. But we're going to keep up maximum pressure. Maximum pressure. Well, the North Koreans remind, this maximum pressure, which means sanctions, squeezing them, that's not quite consistent with the first 2 bullets of that. So that's part of the problem. Okay, just to repeat what I showed last year, and one doesn't need to do for this audience, but I do it for all my students. Just look, what did nuclearization actually mean? You're making the bomb-grade material, plutonium, highly enriched uranium, and if you do hydrogen bombs, tritium. and then be able to design, build, and test nuclear weapons, weaponization, and then you got to deliver. You need the missiles, so that's what you need. So I updated my chart as to what does North Korea actually have. They don't have much plutonium, but it only takes 5 or 6 kilograms for a bomb. They have 20 to 40. Highly enriched uranium, they have somewhat more. We don't know for sure because we don't know exactly where all of their factories are. But somewhere between 400 and 650 kilograms, maybe takes 20, 25 kilograms or so for a bomb. Tritium, very, very little, as best as I can put things together. So they have enough nuclear materials for perhaps 35 nuclear devices. Can they mount them on a missile? We think so, to reach Japan and South Korea. So that makes them pretty potent. I'm almost certain that they cannot yet reach the United States with a nuclear tip missile. You simply need more missile tests and you need more nuclear tests. So as I was trying to help our government to say, what do we want to make sure North Koreans don't do? I said, no missile tests, no nuclear tests. Those are the 2 most important things. I'll show you later, they have actually done that. In 2018, there was not a single nuclear test, not a single missile test. Okay, then I showed you last year, actually I think you were the first audience, that I showed my color charts. And I know this is a night chart, but generally what we did was a very extensive study of the history of the North Korean nuclear program. And so we looked, first of all, from years 1992 to 2017, we said, what did the US do diplomatically? And I showed in colors. The darker the green, the better. 3 shades of green. What did North Korea do diplomatically? Again, the darker the red, the worse. Green means good for us, red means bad for us. Was there a presence on Yongbyon? In other words, were Americans actually there, IAEA people, in their nuclear complex? I was there 4 times. I've been in North Korea 7 times. Did they make plutonium? Did they make highly enriched uranium? Did they make tritium? Did they weaponize? Did they actually build these things or test these things? Can you summarize that? And then what about the missiles? And so what we did was lay out the entire history of what did the North Koreans do? How did they accomplish these nuclear capabilities? And how did they respond to American diplomatic overtures? Or how did we respond to North Koreans? And the bottom line, altogether, it's a very sad story because you can see it goes from green, there's still quite a bit of green during the Clinton administration, to starting to turn red during Bush, then going pretty red, still some pinkish over here in the nuclear capabilities. And then President Obama, who was going to reach out his hand if they unclenched their fist, he could never get it together with North Korea. Just could never get it together. He put his effort into Iran, not into North Korea. And then Trump came in 2017, everything turned completely red. But it was already most of the way there. And then we've also looked at sanctions, we've looked at North-South relations, China relations. We've got, all of this is on the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation website. So I won't go into any detail, but just then to summarize that. So at the end of 17, how do we put all of these pieces together? Well, if I look at the threat to the United States, its capability, what do they have? Well, in 2017, they did have ICBM-class missiles. They did have 6 nuclear tests under their belt. Couldn't quite reach the United States, but they can reach South Korea. We have over 200,000 people in South Korea. And of course also a bunch in Japan. So they had the capabilities to do unacceptable damage. And the intent, Kim Jong-un in one of his messages said, the nuclear button is always on my desk. Of course, Trump out-trumped him. He said, my button's bigger than your button. Scared the daylights out of me, but, it's true. So at that point, the risk of war at the end of 2017 was really high. And so now we look at, so what's happened in 2018? Well, the capability, it hasn't changed much. They haven't enhanced it because no nuclear tests, no missile tests. They continue to make some plutonium, make some highly enriched uranium. Their missile bases, continue to be upgraded, but they've made no major steps forward, and they haven't retreated, greatly in capability. But it's the capability times the intent. And the intent is it's dramatically different today. You look at the Singapore summit, and then you look at President Moon going up to North Korea that was the third of their summits. And they pledged the Korean Peninsula must be turned into a land of peace, free of nuclear weapons and nuclear threats. So what happened then is the threat of war, because of this capability times intent, has decreased dramatically. And indeed, I'm sure as you sit here today, you feel differently than those of you who sat here last year. What are the chances of having a nuclear confrontation on the Korean Peninsula? It's just that much lower today. Now, have they denuclearized, gotten rid of the capability? For the most part, the answer is no. But the intent is different. And because of that, because the threat of war has dropped so dramatically, the way I've tried to put it is this is what buys us space and time for diplomacy. So this is the time when we actually ought to be reaching out and saying, look, can we this time, unlike those 26 years I showed you, can we get the diplomacy and that together? There are a lot of people who actually say that Kim Jong-un, who's a smart fellow, is never going to get rid of his nuclear weapons. Well, never is a big word. It was said before during Soviet times, but then along came Mikhail Gorbachev in March of 1985. Later that year, it said that he turns to Shevardnadze, who was his foreign minister, and Gorbachev said, as he takes over the Soviet Union, we can't go on like this. We can't go on like this. Because the country was just going down. Their economy was in shambles. The communistic system didn't work. He said, we can't go on. And then you look at what Gorbachev did over the next 5-6 years, people wouldn't have predicted that. And then on the lower right is F.W. de Klerk in South Africa. Now, of course, he had very different situation. Apartheid, was just starting to sort of come apart, so to speak. The white ruling class was going to be in difficulty. They had built 6 nuclear weapons, highly enriched uranium nuclear weapons. And of course, people said they'll never get rid of them. And he turned to his cabinet and he said, we can't go on like this. We can't go on like this. He got rid of the nuclear weapons. So I look at that, and again, you look at Moon and you look at Kim. You look at their faces, you look at the embraces. And so I asked, are we at a moment like that today? Perhaps we're Kim, and he's actually said that in 2013 in March. He said, we're going to change our whole formula. Instead of military first, we're going to do both military and economy. And last year he said, we're going to put the emphasis on the economy. He knows that his major threat is actually from the inside. It is a very poor country of 25 million people. And the same people, same Koreans, live on the other side, 50 million, in splendor compared to the north. He knows that he's got to do something. And so what he's after is improving the economy. Of course, he's not going to give away his safety blanket right away. That's going to take diplomacy. But remember, we've got space and time. And what are they going to do with the nukes? The nukes are only good if they don't use them. And this is the most dramatic of the photographs associated with North-South. For those of you who know Korea, this is taken at the top of Mount Paektu, which is a big volcanic crater that borders China. And it's the most sacred of the mountains in Korea. And so Kim took Moon up to Mount Paektu, and they're standing on top and holding hands, the two Koreas holding hands. They want to work together. And that's what Moon is committed to do. However, he's being held back by the United States, and the United States holds the UN sanctions over their heads, and the maximum pressure, isn't quite in concert with what Moon would like to do. They've examined having rail communication and rail network through from the south to the north. Can't do that because of sanctions. What Moon wants to do is build a one economy Korea, that there be two governments, one economy. And actually, it would do him a lot of good, because those 25 million North Koreans are extremely hard-working people. And so, now, so here we come, essentially to the present, and that's Kim Jong-un giving this year's New Year's address. And you may have seen the coverage in the newspaper, and again, the coverage is terrible. It's just amazing these days, both the right and the left, they're all sort of saying, no, this Kim Jong-un, I mean, he's got all these devious things that he wants to do. And to a large extent, I think the coverage, I mean, on the conservative side, they were very skeptical, obviously. And when the Soviet Union broke up, they're very skeptical about lots of things. You don't expect them to embrace North Korea. But more on the liberal or progressive side, I think for the most part, they just don't want to admit that in this particular case, Trump actually did one thing that was good. He met with Kim. Now, he's flunked almost everything since then in the 6 months. He hasn't followed up. But I've worked very closely with his team, and he has a very good team in place. And so there's actually, potential. But that speech it's 4,500 words. There are 33 words in that essentially where Kim says something to the effect, and if the U.S. doesn't want to play, I have other ways to taking care of our sovereignty. And that was the focus, that was the headline. Kim threatens the United States. Well, for 4,400 some words, he's out there saying all these good things about Moon, saying good things about the United States, talking about the economy, telling his people they got to get their act together because the economy is what really matters, and science and technology is important. And then he made this statement in that speech. He says that we will neither make nor test weapons any longer. So he said, we will not use or proliferate them. That's what he said in the statement. Well, that's a lot. So the only thing you need left is for them not to possess them, right? Then you've got the whole thing. Well, he said that also with President Moon. At the summit, they said to make it free of nuclear weapons and nuclear threats. So the point there is, strategically, one actually has the pieces in place. Of course, the thing is, one doesn't really trust them. I mean, you look back over those 26 years, the reason I did those color charts is for people to get a better understanding. It wasn't just them. Yes, they violated lots of those things, but it was also us. We didn't do all those things that we said we're going to do in normalization. And so now you've got this chance. And so strategically the thing is set, but tactically we haven't been able to take the next step. And it just hasn't been done. And so I laid out, and again, I know that's the eye chart, but I just want you to get the general idea of what I've proposed and worked with our government, is to say, okay, so how do we start? How do we get there? And what I have listed here are sort of all the nuclear pieces. Nuclear weapons, personnel, tests, missile tests, plutonium, highly enriched uranium, tritium, and export issues. And then I provided some more granularity as to what you would do. Okay, the American view, and particularly a lot of those in Trump's administration, have said, okay, we can fix this. They just have to get rid of everything now, immediately. They call it CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. Well, anybody who knows anything about Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project, you should know that nothing is irreversible. I mean, it took us 27 months from nothing to the bomb. So how in the world could you ever make anything irreversible? That's silly. And of course, they're not going to do this. And they said, and besides, the way we get started is you tell us, you give us a complete statement of everything that you're going to have. A complete declaration of your nuclear and missile capabilities. You give us that declaration, then we'll compare, and when you're done, then we'll, relieve the maximum pressure. Well, needless to say, they're not going to do that. So they're not going to do that. So what my colleagues and I have proposed is to say, look, don't make all of this red. Red means it's got to go. Yellow means you can actually manage those pieces. So you don't have to say, it's got to go right away. You can manage it. So you can actually go and say, look, you can manage this with time. And instead of saying everything has to go right away, you say first halt, a second roll back, and then eventually eliminate. And that may take 10 years or so. Because to do that, you need to build up trust. So I've actually given our government, specific details of saying, look, here are the things, that you could do. For example, on the nuclear arsenal, first you cap it, then you go ahead, you have to declare it, reduce it, and then eventually eliminate and verify. And so as one looks at this, then the other thing that's not appreciated today at all in the news media or in the American public is which of these things has Kim already done without negotiations have not yet started. Have not yet started. The blue gives you that. So he's actually taken those steps already. I mentioned to you, most important thing was no more nuclear testing. Second, no more missile testing. Actually, the third for me would be no more plutonium. I don't want them to make any more plutonium. And many of you know that plutonium is a lot more potent than highly enriched uranium. Highly enriched uranium will be more problematic. It's going to take more time, but no plutonium. That also no plutonium will mean no tritium because it means no reactors. So he's already taken those steps, and I've talked to the South Koreans who've talked to Kim, and they said he's taken those steps, and he is, very frustrated that he's not getting credit for any of that. And then we've actually laid out for our government to say, if you really want to solve this, what you want to do is actually say, look, in the end, it doesn't all have to be red. You don't have to get rid of everything that was nuclear. The green means it's okay. And what the green means, it's the peaceful nuclear energy, electricity, nuclear medicine. Space. Space, why can't they have a space program? Well, we used to say they can't do space because if you launch a space rocket, you learn something about missiles. They're so much farther ahead on missiles today than they are on space rockets, it doesn't make any more difference. We used to say they can't have reactors because if they make reactors, they learn how to make plutonium. They already know how to make plutonium. They already have put it into bombs. They know how to enrich uranium. So if what we've proposed is to actually say, get the North Koreans involved and say what we're going to do, we're going to work with you guys to help you convert your military facilities to civilian facilities. But we'll only do that if we can be there with you. So it'd be a little bit like going back to what we did with the Russians. So that's the idea. And then sort of put all of that together. So if they're going to do that, what do they get in return? Well, normalization. That's what he's after, and particularly, and again, people will tell you, the pundits will tell you in the United States, he wants to split. Kim is doing all of this to split the United States from South Korea. Well, we just won't let him. If that's what he wants to do, we just won't let him. We work closely with the South. Or that all he wants is a peace treaty. Well, we would like, to have a peace treaty, but the single most important thing that Kim wants right now, he's got to do something about the economy, and that's the sanctions relief. And so what I've been proposing is what I just showed you, the yellow and then the green, is you mesh that with sanctions relief. And so they take steps that reduce the nuclear threat. We loosen up on the sanctions, and you go, and again, today, we can take that risk. It was hard to do in 2017, but we could take that risk today. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, his speech did give us this one potential hint to say, well, what's the alternative for Kim? Well, it turns out he was just in China for his 4th visit in 10 months. None in the previous 6 years. And the Chinese are courting him without question. The Chinese understand that North Korea is an important piece as far as they're concerned. The thing that we have going for us, and I've told this audience that before, the North Koreans can't stand the Chinese. They're beholden to the Chinese. 90% of their trade is with China. They don't like being dependent on the Chinese. And Moon has opened up this avenue, so why drive them to China if they're driving themselves to north-south? If we Americans could just get out of the way and let those guys hold hands. Will they give up their nuclear weapons? Will North and South come together to make better lives for all the people on the Korean Peninsula? I don't know. But I think it's time to find out. Okay, I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, and of course I'll be happy to answer questions with help with a microphone, and I particularly need help with hearing the questions. I like to tell my students that my hearing is electronically assisted. I thought that sounds a lot better than, I can't hear.
Sig, thank you for the talk. When you present the idea of loosening sanctions in order to encourage further, I guess you could call it denuclearization from the North Korean regime, what kind of reception do you get in D.C.?
In D.C., so right, yeah, the question was, when you talk about loosening sanctions, in return for reducing the nuclear threat, what kind of reception in D.C.? So far it's been maximum pressure. So that's a Trump term and the Trump enclave, sort of National Security Council and Trump enclave. So, and interestingly enough, it's actually parroted by the South Koreans. I just met with the South Korean ambassador out at Stanford before we came back here. And we had a long session, and he told me, well, yes, we want to do all these other things, but we're still for maximum pressure. And I said, but you say that because that's what Washington wants you to do. Of course, he couldn't admit that. So the word has still been, no, we have to keep the pressure on. However, I see it changing. And so, for example, just one of the things was that the administration had actually gone to the point of not just increasing the sanctions and the pressures and all of that, but actually cutting the humanitarian assistance and links to North Korea. And just in this past week, the administration, and particularly the main envoy now for North Korea discussions, has just announced that the administration has backed away from that. And so they're going to allow humanitarian assistance, humanitarian visits, and particularly also other countries. Because in the end, the U.S. controls essentially everything through the fact that the UN sanctions are there. And the U.S. is the one that really helps to crank up the UN sanctions. So I think what Washington has to get over is to say, yeah, you don't just relieve the sanctions for nothing. So each time you relieve a sanction, you expect them to do something that reduces the nuclear threat. Kim has gone as far as I didn't discuss it here, for no nuclear testing. And those of you who pay attention, you've seen that. He not only has said so, but he's blown up the test tunnels. Okay? So he blows up the test tunnels, and the pundits say, oh, well, he just caved in the front, and he didn't allow inspectors, those could probably be resurrected almost immediately. Well, I don't know how long it would take him. Again, nothing is irreversible, but it was a big deal to blow up those test tunnels.
Well, the word was also that the mountain was about to cave in.
Yeah, and so, right, so the word was that the mountain was about to cave in, and it turns out it's not true. It's not true. You see so much of this junk out there. That's what we try to do with these color charts, and I publish lots of stuff, and it turns out that particular test, September 3rd of 2017, they blew something up which had maybe 200 to 250 kilotons. So that's 10 times, their previous high, 10 times Nagasaki. Most likely was a hydrogen bomb. The North Koreans have been extremely careful of how they buried their device in the mountain. They've had almost no leakage, much to our dismay, because if the stuff would leak, then we could actually tell what they had. But they have hardly leaked anything. So they've done this superb job, but that one was big. And so the outside of the mountain slid, and that tunnel was probably not reusable, but they had 2 other tunnels that were ready to go. And so no, in the same vein, Kim actually said to Moon in the summit up in Pyongyang, I'm willing to dismantle all of Yongbyon. Again, the pundits came out and said, well, that's no big deal. He's got another high enrichment plant someplace else. Well, he does, at least 1, maybe 2. But Yongbyon is the heart of their nuclear program. If you would actually shut down and dismantle that, I would say, oh my God, that is a big, big deal. Now, again, he hasn't done that. It was conditional if there were corresponding measures from the United States. The most important corresponding measures were those sanctions. Next question. Yes, in the back.
Thanks. Hi, I'm a post-bachelor student here at the lab this year. Thank you for the talk. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'm a post-bachelor student at the lab this year, and thanks for the excellent talk. I'm really interested in getting more involved in this issue. So I'm currently working on non-proliferation using anti-neutrinos. And I'm also interested, I've recently begun collaborating with a Chinese group on a reactor anti-neutrino experiment. And someone who's about to go on to graduate school, I'm interested, how do I get involved in the Young Nuclear Professionals Forum?
Good. So it's very simple. So the question was, how do I get involved with the young professionals for a postgraduate student here? S. Hecker at stanford.edu. It's as simple as that. Gannon, why don't you say, at the risk of embarrassing me, why don't you stand up? So Gannon is a postdoc here at Los Alamos, and I first got hooked up with Gannon when he was up at Washington State University. And we embraced them into the Young Professionals group in China, and then Gannon worked with us with the Russians also, and he's now a postdoc here at Los Alamos as well. And so the people that I take as part of the Stanford group come from all over the United States. From University of Michigan, Washington State, some from Texas, New York. Actually, only a few from Stanford, because Stanford gave up its nuclear engineering completely. And there is no nuclear physics department at Stanford. But nevertheless, they have very good political science, international relations, and a few technical. Actually, one of the postdocs that was here at Stanford now did some of her graduate work here and at UNM, Ms. Chantal Murphy. So we'd love to have you aboard. And you can look up Gannon also, but S. Hecker at stanford.edu, just send me the email. Check.
Sig, I'm hoping somebody puts you up for a Nobel Peace Prize. If Israel got rid of their nuclear weapons, would Iran still want nuclear weapons?
We are in Los Alamos. I have clearances still. And the official U.S. government position is that we do not know whether Israel has nuclear weapons or not. And if you have a clearance, that will be your official position. So we don't know. That's a question of the issue.
Sig, very nice talk. Thank you. About 7 years ago, you gave a similar talk, or a talk on a similar subject in the physics department auditorium at Lannell. And one of the statements you made at that time was that the issue was that, with regard to the Koreas, was that reunification had not happened, and that was driving the tensions on the peninsula. I asked you the question at that time, well, why not then reunify? And it was like saying something inappropriate. But you started this talk today saying that prediction is very hard, especially about the future. But could I ask you if you have thought about, or if you could speculate about a path from today to reunification of the Korean Peninsula?
Sure, I can speculate. So I wasn't very hopeful about the reunification, because the political systems are so dramatically different, and then the economic conditions are really dramatically different. And as I've now gone quite a few times to South Korea, what I found, and I know Nina was there with me in one of my trips, and she found this amazing. As we talked to the younger South Koreans, they said, unification? Yeah, we don't want to unify. We got to like these heated toilet seats. I mean, look, that's what you get if you go in a hotel in Seoul. You get heated toilet seats. In the north, you have outhouses. That's like the that Parito of the old days. So it turns out I was pretty negative, but I feel quite positive now in that I don't know how and when unification will happen, but it doesn't matter as much anymore because the South, at least under Moon, has figured out that, hey, we're willing to live with these guys. And that's really the important part. It's those two. They're the same people. The same people cut in half. And they said, hey, we're willing to do this. And Moon said, we're willing to do this. Moon actually has it figured out. It turns out, as South Korea is an economic miracle. It really is, what they've been able to pull off in the last 30 years. However, they're like so many of these miracles. Japan happened the same thing. They grow up, they grow like crazy, and then they plateau. And so now they're plateauing, people are comfortable, and they're not growing the way they want to grow. And so I think Moon actually has it figured out, that economically, if he can merge those two, you bring 25 million people into it, 50 million people. They work like the dickens up in the north. They bring them together. And most of the mineral resources, by the way, on the Korean Peninsula in the north, not in the south. And so you bring those two together. And so my feeling at this point is, if they work this economic integration, the rest will happen. But that's actually going to be the hard part. I think the denuclearization part in the end is actually going to be easier than how do you get those two people who now for 70 years have lived so differently, even though they're the same bloodlines. How do you get them to integrate to go forward? So, my view would be, it may happen 20 years, who knows, as far as unification, actually having a political integration of some sort. But the one other, this is really wild speculation. As people say, well, why would Kim Jong-un, actually want to do this and get rid of his nuclear weapons? And so I speculate in the following way. So Kim Jong-un is sitting there. He was in Switzerland. He grew up as a young boy in Switzerland. So he's there, and he's saying, and that system that Korean system. It's not just that he's a dictator, all powerful. But he's almost looked like a god. That whole family is viewed that way. So Kim Jong-un looks at this and he says, okay, so what's my big deal? What am I going to be known for? Now this is really, wild speculation, but you asked for it. I can see Kim Jong-un saying, "Oh, let's see. So Kim Il-sung, he was the great leader. He was the father. He was the founder of our country. And so he will be there in history forever up there." And you have the big bronze statues all over Pyongyang. Kim Jong-il, he saved the country in the 90s from famine and from all that. As the Russians deserted us, Chinese deserted us, he saved us and he brought us through, especially against the Americans. And so he's going to be known. And you know what I'm going to be known for? As the great unifier. I'm the guy who was able to bring the two Koreas together. Bring our people back together. Okay, any other speculative questions? Yes, Natalie.
Sid, in one of your last slides, you pointed out that we're at the point where diplomacy is necessary. Do you feel our State Department has adequate diplomats?
Right. So Natalie asks, I point out that diplomacy is necessary, and does the State Department have adequate diplomats and the ability for diplomacy? Well, it turns out that even though I thought Rex Tillerson was a control rod, but he also, for the most part, sort of gutted the State Department. He ran it like an industrial executive and sort of get rid of all the things you don't need. And not realizing, the U.S. is in there with every one of the 194 countries or so that we have. And you got to have people that have expertise in those countries. You can't get rid of those people. And so I think the bottom line is he did a terrible job running the State Department. The State Department employees were glad to get rid of him. Well, actually, Trump got rid of him, with a tweet. And Pompeo, I still don't know about Pompeo, but at least he was a politician, came from the House, and he realized you got to have a State Department. And so they've still got it. I think they're still weak. However, this particular team right now for North Korea is very good. They actually have the diplomatic moxie, and then they're willing to reach out to people within the U.S. and other countries that have different views and different opinions. And so I'm quite encouraged. I think the trick is, how do you work this into Trump's moods? Because that's what you're stuck with. The next major breakthrough with North Korea will only come when Kim and Trump get back together. Kim is smart enough that he knows he's got all those other guys in Washington who don't trust him at all. And then he's got Trump, who wants to make a deal. And again, people are concerned that he's going to make some terrible deal. Well, the deal he's made so far, we don't have any more. That's not so bad. And so his team, the team that Trump has, can advise them, but it still has to work with the whims of the president, and that's going to be a real difficult trick, especially since obviously, we have our hands full. By the way, I was there during the previous longest government shutdown. 21 days in 1995-96, I was director at Los Alamos. Let me just say, that's no fun. And of course, we did not lose our salaries, as the current Los Alamos employees don't. But there's so many parts of the government that it was a terrible, tough time. And you can actually go back. It's something you might be interested in going back. That came as a result of the fact that Newt Gingrich and a bunch of conservative congressmen, mostly, there wasn't many congresswomen at that time, were elected in November 1994. And they had a very different view of how the government should be run. Medicare and many of the other social programs. And Newt Gingrich essentially said, we're not paying for that stuff. We're not paying for that. And so they wound up arguing. However, I just was going back to read today. And at that time, Newt Gingrich said, Bill Clinton and I met 35 times, during that standoff. Because we both knew we've got to figure out some way to get out of this. But there, it was for a real cause. There were real significant differences as to how the two parties felt. One should deal with the various government programs. And it lasted a long time, but now we've gone over that. Yes, Bill.
Mike here. So clearly the Chinese could be wherever they wanted with respect to a nuclear weapons program. And yet they aren't expanding. What do we need to keep doing so that that situation continues?
Yeah, so the question was, the Chinese have decided not to build up, not to go to the arms race. So maybe we've done something right. What do we need to continue to do right? I think the Chinese just have it figured out. Very much unlike the Russians. Actually, by watching the Russians, they pretty much can just decide to do the opposite. So the Russian economy is still tanking. It's built primarily on the fossil fuels and their resources. And they're not, and of course what's such a pity about the Russians, they have such a good educational system. They have such smart people. And they're not getting anywhere in the economy. Instead, they're building hypersonic glide vehicles with nuclear weapons or torpedoes. So that's where they're putting all of the emphasis. And the Chinese are watching that, and they said, we don't want to go there. So the Chinese are putting all their money into the economy. As part of that, they've also, they've been stealing, as much of our trade secrets as they possibly can, our tech, secrets and capabilities. And of course, the U.S. helped the Chinese from the beginning. When once Mao was out and Deng Xiaoping came in, U.S. policy was, particularly industrial policy. I know I dealt a lot with Bob Galvin from Motorola. Is he opened up the mobile phone business in China? Because he said, we've got not quite 300 million people at that time in the U.S. They've got 1.3 billion people. We're going to sell a lot of cell phones. So we did. As part of that, they got a lot of the cell phone technologies. They got a lot of the rest of the technologies. So we helped them for some time. But now, where we're essentially at equivalence, that takes some change. And so what we need to do is figure out how do we deal with China economically. They, by themselves, have decided they're not going to put that money into nuclear weapons. They put it into conventional modernization and not into nuclear weapons. And I deal with the Chinese nuclear people still a lot, and they essentially say, look, we have what we need to deter the United States. Not a good answer, but I don't know that it's really what we do rather than the success of what they've done. It works, and so they continue to go in the direction. Although the other thing certainly that we should do, we should not junk nuclear treaties. We should not junk the nuclear treaties. And we should also not abandon our allies. And unfortunately, that's also what's happened, in the last year or two. There's a question in the back.
Sig, you talked about most of the other nuclear powers in the world and the threats they present. How do they perceive us as a threat? Both nuclear, conventional, economic, etc. How do your contacts and the folks that you see over there look at us?
Well, I read a really disturbing number yesterday in relation to that. A poll in Germany asked, how many of you consider the United States a threat to Germany? 55%. How many of you consider Russia to be a threat to Germany? 56%. So that I'm afraid is basically where we are today. That's one of the just sad things of what's happened in this administration. This whole idea of America first. I mean, just imagine. I mean, you're over there, you're the allies. You're saying, "Hey, wait a minute. You know what's happening?" You know, the U.S. has worked with us for all these years. I also just read earlier today a quote that I think, you know, the people around our president and the president should actually, maybe one can get it on Fox News. I'm not sure exactly how, but it would be worthwhile. And that is, there was a book, it talked about Charles de Gaulle. Okay, now de Gaulle was a Frenchman. He was proud of being a Frenchman. He was hard over as a Frenchman, right? And de Gaulle made a distinction between patriotism and nationalism. And I think that's the one that we in this country need to go back, and certainly this administration needs to go back. And what he said, patriotism is when the love of your fellow countrymen and women comes first. That's patriotism. Nationalism is when the hatred for all the others comes first. And he said, you know, and he sort of built why being French, why French is exceptional as a country, but it was built in such a way that it's done to make the world a better place, and the French are going to be part of that world. And so we've lost that, and so the answer is, that's really hurt us immensely. And so, you know, can U.S. recover from that? You know, I should hope so. But as you know, what's happened in this country, and it's not just Trump, you know, you look at one country after another, all these nationalists, and they are nationalists. They're filled by hatred, filled by keeping people out, filled by wanting to build walls and doing those things. That's not the way that one needs to go. And so, you know, the whole world has gone in this direction, and in my opinion is very unfortunate. One of my colleagues at Stanford has just recently written a book trying to explain some of that as to why does one have this outburst of this populism on national. It's called Identity, and I recommend it. His name is Francis Fukuyama. Okay, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close it up here.